Welcome to In the SALOON with. I'm Jane Messer. Hello, I'm Jane Messer and this is In the SALOON with guests Michelle Hamadache and Luke Johnson. Michelle and Luke are both writers. They teach creative writing and have been fiction editors for at least 2 Australian literary journals. And so I thought it'd make a really cool conversation to have them in here together. Their stories, Ferocious Animals by Luke and The Crane Flies by Michelle, were read to a live audience at StorySALOON's November show by the actors Bailey Prendergast and Charlotte Salazinski. So Luke and Michelle have met before at a really fabulous night, which was only a couple of weeks ago. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Jane. Hi, Luke.
Hi, Luke.
G'day, how are you?
Good. Just a little bit of background for listeners. Luke is the author of the short story collection Ferocious Animals and a poetry collection titled Kangaroo Unbound. He has won or been listed for numerous national prizes over his writing life, including the Elizabeth Jolley Short Story Prize. He's also a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Wollongong and incoming fiction editor at the recently revived journal Southerly. Michelle Hamadache is a writer of short stories, essays and reviews with publications in Australian, British and US journals. She has had short stories long and shortlisted for the Elizabeth Jolley and Neilma Sidney Short Story Prizes, which I might just say, these are really prestigious prizes. They're entered into by thousands of very good writers, and to be longlisted or shortlisted is not a small thing. So congratulations, Luke and Michelle, on those. Michelle is also a lecturer in creative writing at Macquarie University and is a former fiction editor with the journals Southerly and Mascara Literary Review. So there's lots of overlaps here, which I think we're going to delve into in our conversation. But to begin, I'd like to talk about each story in turn, and so I thought I'd follow the pattern of the night. So starting with Luke, your story was performed wonderfully by Bailey Prendergast just before that interval. Little summary, it's 1989 and grand final day. We have boy David who idolises his father.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that story?
Well, I think I was exercising some demons there because I do remember the 1989 New South Wales Rugby League grand final, and my team was in the grand final for the second year running. That was the Balmain Tigers, and we'd lost the previous year, and we were to lose again this year, although this story takes place at the beginning of the day, so the character in the story is not quite aware of that impending loss and can only imagine that this is going to be the best day of his life probably. He's just a young kid and, winning the final means everything. As tends to happen in stories, things take a somewhat more dramatic turn. It doesn't unfold as people would like it to unfold, who find themselves caught up in these moments, i.e. the characters. So we don't quite get as far as the grand final itself. It's not really a story about football or about sport or matches. It's more a story about the kind of cultural milieu surrounding those events, which I find kind of interesting in many ways, like a big grand final match or the Melbourne Cup or whatever it is. These are sort of shared events that happen, and they tend to transcend class barriers and social barriers, and so for me it just kind of makes for a nice sort of a background for a much smaller, more domestic kind of drama, which is what you get with the story.
What was interesting was that Tamsin, my production assistant who I work with and who is a wonderful reader, and we've had wonderful discussions about the stories, she was like, Jane, are you sure you want to do a story about football? And I'm like, it is a story about football. It's not really a story about football. It's a story about a family. And so we kind of talked through that, and it was interesting the way that, you used, it's very much part of the story.
Well, it's just such a gorgeous transformation because that whole scale's falling from the eyes and the mother emerging as this powerful figure. I mean, it's a beautiful story to listen to.
Yeah, I don't think it gives anything away to say It's grand final day. The dad and the son, the 8-year-old son, are just like a little pair of very, very eager footy beavers. They've got this special haircut. They've got the clothes on. They're decorating the exterior of the house. The mother is very, very pregnant and is participating but is a bit outside of it. And then a whole lot of argy-bargy starts to happen out on the street. And there's a lot of anger, and the boy is shifting from idolising his father, and he's gradually, in the course of the story, that admiration and cleaving to his father kind of changes because of the mother's absolute desire and determination for there to be no violence. And she is remarkable. Each of the characters is so individual and remarkable, the way you've portrayed them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I kind of suppose that I conceived of it a little bit like its own little football match, this game. The boy is the figurative football in this match, and the competing teams are, the masculine, violent side, and then the maternal, protective side, and the boy is sort of being kicked back and forth between these two, and we're waiting to find out who's going to come away with the victory, essentially. And some of that, for anyone that was interested in reading the story more closely, I think I was also interested in the way in which space is used to draw out drama. And so, in my mind as I was writing it, I was kind of conceiving of this sort of figurative football pitch and these teams moving back and forward, and there's sort of try line at each end, and we're just kind of waiting to see where it ends up.
In the setting of the story, which it's definitely not a football field, but the choreography of the characters and the sense of being in a very specific house with a very specific porch, with a path that leads to a low fence, and then the street where this car comes up and stops. And this is the kind of provocation because the car is for the opposing team. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it and rereading it when we were rehearsing it with Bailey Prendergast, seeing how well the story is choreographed with the way the mother tries to draw him back inside. He is drawn back inside the screen, the mosquito screen that he can see through to his dad, but she doesn't want him to go back out there. Then, of course, she ends out there, and then, they come back again. And it is beautifully... In fact, actually, we'll get to Michelle's stories later, but there is choreography in both those stories.
Yeah, I think a lot of great stories are essentially just a tussle over space, whether it's, sharks and jets battling it out for a corner block, or whether it's, Capulets and Montagues deciding who's going to rule the roost. It often just comes down to a matter of protecting turf, which probably tells us something about the evolutionary roots of storytelling. So football or tennis or whatever your sport is tends to be a really nice analogue for this battle that's, I think, probably been going on for a very long time. And storytellers can exploit that, as I've tried to do in this story, and squeeze as much drama out of it as possible.
Indeed. And Michelle, your story, The Crane Flies, actually, interestingly, only set 2 years later. So Luke's is 1989. The narrator is the older self. He was 8 at the time. Your story, the narrator is sort of older, but we don't quite know how much. But she's a young woman in the story. 2 lovers, herself, the Australian, and Sofiane, the Algerian, in the wilds of Italy. Looking for work, they find work. They have to get to that workplace, the hotel, where they meet La Donna Canone. Do you want to talk a little bit about the story?
Yeah.
And then they have a terrible time. And then they leave. So where's this?
Look, I think when I think about that short story and its capacity to sort of capture it's a maxim to say this, a slice of life and the short story. But it does more than that. It kind of magnifies that moment in life and it intensifies it. I think it is just one of the most motivating and powerful forces of writing is the desire to kind of capture something. And so that was a chapter of my life totally, well, actually, perhaps not as exaggerated when I was thinking of, as I think about it, but it exists in, I guess, a corner of my memory, and the desire to sort of capture a moment from my life when I guess we were living in a really different way to the way that we live now, and so it's
very poor.
Well, it's about memory. It's about being outside of sort of a mainstream way of life. It's about sort of occupying the shadows and the recesses, and a big part of it was sort of that sense that at that moment, Sofian is a clandestine migrant in Italy, and all of what that meant in terms of secrecy and the types of work that you could apply for and the way that you ended up treated. And, but more than that, it's that there's these whole worlds that are outside, and they are operating under their own rules, and there's power dynamics, and in that world Donna Canone had everything. She had everything that we wanted. And
so Sofian and the narrator are, I guess, in their early 20s. They've met possibly in Italy, it seems, and they need some work. They haven't got any money. He's illegal. She's, obviously travelling on an Australian passport, lucky her. And there's some sort of references to that inequality, I guess you could say. And so they travel by train, and then they hitch a ride, and then they have to hike, and then at last they get to this hotel, which La Donna Canone is the mistress of. And she puts them... They're starving, they've smoked all their cigarettes, they haven't, they've spent all their money on coffee and cigarettes, haven't eaten in ages, they're getting a bit frayed, and she shows them to this terrible room, which is just, the mood of the hotel, the crying babies, the sort of strange, it's very late. And then they work for hours and hours and hours and hours in, the Dante's Hill kitchen, washing and drying and washing and drying, and getting hungrier and more exhausted, particularly the narrator. And then they plead for food, and it becomes quite... The way she offers them the food, it becomes she's so disgusting that it's almost inedible, of course. And ultimately they flee the place and are quite fractious together. But at the story's end, I'm not going to say anything. It's a spoiler.
But I think with the short story, it's not about the ending, and so it's not the same in the sense of like with a novel, somebody tells you what happens at the end of the novel, and you put the novel down.
Yeah.
But I think with the short story, the ending is almost present from the beginning, and so you're actually reading for a really different experience. And so I think no need for a spoiler alert. Just tell it as it is, Jane.
Traveller, marry me. It was just a beautiful, beautiful moment at the end of that story. But I thought it was, when we're curating each Story Saloon night, which presents 3 short stories, they're recorded live, the audience experiences all 3 stories together in the one night, and then we edit them into episodes so that they're an individual episode. But in the night itself, you want each story to contrast and complement and to take the audience on a journey. And I felt that what we had with your story, Luke, was this very suburban, leaning into the small town, the suburbia, the football, the nuclear family, the tensions between that. And then with Michelle's story, we're leaning into a totally different mood of the wilds of Italy, grotesquerie, exaggeration, mythical elements. And that they're wonderful individual stories, but they're also beautiful paired together because they're completely unlike each other.
Yeah, they're very different, that's for sure.
But in a sense, I think with a short story, there's always kind of this dark heart. And, that when I listened to your story being read aloud, right from the beginning, there was that sort of sense of menace right on the, and characters right on the precipice of tipping into something that I think is integral to the short story. And it sort of draws us in. And of course, of course the short story has that whole sort of genealogy and connection to Poe and horror, but also how dark fairy tales are. And I think of it as that sort of dark fairy detail. And so it does, I think, retain those elements. And yeah, I mean, I adored, and even in the sort of the image of, sort of the not just pregnant, the sort of right on the point of sort of popping pregnancy, and, sort of the bodily descriptions, that's so much a part of the short story. And I could see that family. Like I sat there, and although we had no screens, no music, no sets, no nothing, just in the sheer act of listening to your story being read, I could see it as though it was being played in front of me. And I think that's a testimony to the power of your writing.
Oh, well, I mean, that's music to my ears. I'll just sit here and listen to that all day long. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think your point before, Jane, about pairing these different kinds of stories is true. This is one of the things that you can get away with when you're editing an anthology or something like that. It's almost like a curatorial act, right? You're looking for things that are going to draw out the features and significant aspects of the other work as well. And was it Monica? Is that
Monica
first?
Ilya, yeah.
Yeah, and that first story also, I think, really paired nicely. Like it made for a nice trio on the night.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's doing something quite different as well. It was a sort of a more ostensibly humorous kind of story. I think it was working on that level. I think the story I wrote was a nice transition into Michelle's story. I think my story, hopefully, I find it funny, but not funny in the way that Monica's is funny. So I think it was a nice, thinking about the way that you put that together, not just the three stories, but even the way in which they were ordered.
Well, there's quite a lot of curating in the order, because you want Monica's story it's a really wonderful little story about this, narrated by a young Assyrian woman. She's just a teenager. She's not really even a woman. She's like 13 or something, 12, I think. And she's so naive but so insightful and so ready for a future big life that means something, but she's so young and she's at the she's like a child. Anyway,
the colour of that story, and I think the link with the food, and just also her willingness to sort of just put herself on the line, and sort of the fun of sharing, the really humiliating things that we do when we lust after someone, when we're on that cusp of sort of so wanting to fall in love and to be desired and to desire, and yet sort of everything that we do just confounds us, and so her willingness to sort of share that, and she performed it so beautifully. And then I think also just with the magic of the languages coming together was it was superb. It recreated that moment with such colour and vibrancy.
Yes, I agree, and also it's a lighter story, and then your story, Luke, is a darker story, though with comedic elements. But, it was also a serious story about, well, the seriousness of it was about the father's propensity for violence and anger over, for goodness sake, the grand final, which would wreck the whole day, and probably did wreck the whole day, even though the mother managed to kind of settle the waters with great effort.
Yeah,
the rest of the day just couldn't have flowed happily after that.
No, the grand final, I suppose, in some ways, the catalyst for the violence that does take place or almost takes place. But of course, what's really at stake here is not whether one's team wins or loses. It's something more about male ego and pride and looking like a man in front of your son, or some version of a man that you think is important for him to see. So these are the kinds of things that I'm, obviously most interested in looking at in that story, or the things that I was trying to draw out, or where I was trying to locate the drama. As I mentioned before, the grand final just becomes a somewhat convenient backdrop for all of that, because what comes with it are all those other kind of cultural rituals, like getting drunk, like bearing your team colours, or in this instance, I think it's a flag on the front of the car or whatever. But the kinds of behaviours that we see, followed to their nth degree, leading to, full-scale wars against nations happening at a much, much smaller scale in a little town somewhere in New South Wales.
But I also think that sport and carnival, like carnival, they play a really important part. And it's something, it's a part of life that I think gets ironed out all the time. And I think, that intense, explosive, like there was that simmering sort of anger and just on the cusp of violence. But within those rituals of sport, you could also see, sort of community, because you could see the ways in which some of the cars were sort of joining in,
allies,
we do live in ways that are perhaps more and more regulated and controlled and sort of middle of the road, and we never get to break out. And so I think sport does perform, because we don't get our own kinds of, especially somewhere like, for example, Australia, we don't have our versions of carnival. We don't have our moments when we can let loose and all of the rules drop and we reverse roles and we're something else for a little while. And so sometimes it is our stories and it's in our imaginations, and sometimes it's sport. And I think that that's one of the things that you did so beautifully, because yes, you didn't run away from the fact that there is this propensity for things to go wrong and to turn into something that is unpleasant. But you also captured some of the things that are really beautiful about those rituals. And it's said from somebody who doesn't, I don't know one end of a football from another, but I can sort of, listening to it, I could understand both, that's what a story does, isn't it? Like, it doesn't try and resolve it one way or the other, but it says, actually, we have to have both of these elements, and hopefully, sort of sometimes the good wins out, and the mum did, and
I'll never forget.
There was a reversal.
She vanquished them all with a slipper. With a slipper that she flung. And that image landed very, very well for me. For you, Michelle, you're using, so in Luke's story, there's the slipper, there's the football colours, there's objects that are kind of portals for lots more in the story. In yours, you've got the crane flies, these spindly large flies that nothing like an Australian blowfly.
No, they look more like mosquitoes.
Like vast mosquitoes.
Huge mosquitoes. They look like mosquitoes, but they're not. And they are these beautiful creatures. And the funny thing was...
But you don't want them infesting the bed that you have to sleep on.
No, but they do kind of end up uneasy companions. And it was... the power of the grotesque is that, it combines things that are hideous with things that are beautiful, things that are old with things that are young, things that are mechanical with things that are natural. And so it disrupts all of our ways of organising the world. And so for me, sort of those crane flies, they're visitors, but they're kind of on their own quest. Like the poor things that are at the end of their, they're at the end of their days. And it was really sort of important to kind of create connections and, I guess, sort of similarities and, sort of homologies or whatever across the sort of the creatures, so that it wasn't this case of yucky crane flies, horrible donna canone, or, sort of dirty migrants. It was this case that everybody was kind of both contaminated and beautiful, sort of problematic, but also just defiantly there. What do you do with me? I'm here, I exist, and I'm going to make my way through things. And in a sense, they were, from the perspective of La Donna Canone, they're disposable. They can come, they can work, they can die for all she cares, because she'll just look up for, for the next migrant who will take their places.
So later in the story, you realise that the reason they're there is because she has a book, basically, that connects her, or she has a number of what she calls the African smuggler. So he's somebody who is able to locate illegals, so-called illegals, such as the Algerian Sofiane, and get them work. But of course, because they don't have proper papers.
Well, essentially because the Australian doesn't work fast enough. She can't wash dishes fast enough. She can't keep up.
Sofiane is great at washing dishes.
Not so great, almost there.
She's not so great. So if it wasn't for the Australian, Donna Canone says that he could continue working there But in terms of the visual memorable moments, the other one in that story is they're so hungry, and she really is awful to them. I mean, she can be awful, and she is awful. She just is like gets them working.
But they share their world, and I think that was one of the things is that it is this complete world, and it's outside the usual rules and regulations and the ways that we behave and propriety and what's polite and how we speak about women and how we speak about men and how we speak about migrants. And so even though they're all really, sort of inflammatory and inappropriate with their language, they share a level and they share a world. And so in a strange way, there's sort of a strange sort of egalitarianness that they recognise in each other that, was really important to me to capture. And also because I just love, I love inappropriate language, I think that, and finding ways that you can sort of capture the colour, of profanity and, sort of the things that shouldn't be said without replicating the problematic hierarchies and prejudices that go with it.
So Sofiane is able to swear at La Donna Canone in Algerian, which he doesn't understand, but the narrator does understand to know he's saying some very rude things. And then he returns to Italian and is polite and says, when will we be able to have a meal, please? Or, he's very polite. And then, yeah.
And one of the things that I was really trying to show was actually sort of the linguistic, sort of facility, like the ease of switching between sort of English, Italian, and the way all of these languages are sort of happening at once. And it's not the main agenda. Like, she doesn't care what language they speak. She knows that he said something foul. All of these things are sort of the possibilities within language, I think, really exciting.
And you certainly see that in the story later on, I think in those closing images before they leave of when the narrator, it's nighttime and she looks out of the bedroom window and realises that La Donna Canone, this huge kind of canon.
Because there's a Francesco Gregori song called La Donna Canone, and it is about a woman who sort of gets effectively, I guess, shot out of the cannon, and it is her story. It was actually listening to the song of La Donna Canone that kind of gave me the sense of how it could turn into a song, or just, sort of the impetus to get it going. Because, obviously that wasn't I never knew what her name was, but in hearing that song, I sort of understood that there was a way of sort of referring to her that would allow me to build the character around her.
Yes, I think you did that. I think you did it so very, very well. So as both of you have written quite a few short stories over time, and often short story writers, write in many other ways and modes as well, and you both do that. What can you say about the short story that draws you to it as a form? Luke?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, maybe this isn't the best story to illustrate the point I'm about to make, but as part of a collection, which I think many of the other stories probably do a good job of testifying to what I'm about to say, and that is it gives you the opportunity to be more formally experimental, to push the boundaries of what someone will tolerate. And, that could be...
Because of the brevity?
Yeah, because of the brevity, because they're only with it for a short amount of time. So there's a story that accompanies this one in the collection that's written in the conditional past tense, and it's 5,000 words. And I think by the end of that 5,000 words, you're getting... Can
you give us an illustration of the conditional past tense, please, Luke?
Would have.
Yes.
All the verbs are preceded by would have. And for me, there was something... The conditional past and the habitual past share the same grammatical structure. So that became a bit of a feature for me. That was a way of using grammar to magnify drama. So there's a little shift that happens at the end of that story where you realise you may have been misinterpreting the tense, and that may affect everything. And the point about short stories being able to be read in a single sitting means that you have this concentrated period of time where someone sets aside half an hour or whatever it takes to read a particular short story. And they hopefully, if it's done well enough, can hold all of those elements in their head for the duration of that story. So an effect like that of making that slight shift at the end, hopefully it works. It comes into being or it lands. Whereas in a novel, it's very rare that someone would sit down and read an entire novel in one sitting. So some of those things are going to be lost. Some of those things that happen early on are going to perhaps be forgotten unless they are cleverly reinserted at other parts of the text. So you have this kind of heightened experience of everything happening in what feels like pretty much like a present moment, which is not the same as a longer, more extended work of fiction like a novel. In that regard, it's probably more like going to watch a piece of theatre or sitting down and listening to a symphony or something like that, where people tend to do them in a single sitting, or a movie as opposed to a TV series that might have 20 episodes in it. So, yeah, I think what draws me to it primarily is the possibility of achieving that single effect. I think all of the stories I write, if I have a distinguishing feature that separates me from other writers or that makes me a particular kind of writer, it is that I feel like I've got to construct these entire sort of symbolic matrices or matrices, whatever the plural is there, in order to have this one moment, hopefully this single moment at the end that feels like it cuts through, it strikes at the heart of the reader. Whereas that's just not the way one sets about writing a novel. It's not about a single moment. It's a much more prolonged affair.
And Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, and you've said so much that I totally concur with. I mean, there's this wonderful invitation for intensity. Like, you can let loose with language in a way that I don't think you would do with a novel. I think it takes a slice of life, but then it distorts it, because of that compressed poetics. That and sometimes I think as readers, it's easy to try and read a short story in the same way that you read a novel, and then you lose so much of it because the short story doesn't operate like that. Sort of in some ways, so much of it is vertical, sort of rather than sort of horizontal. So in that way, it kind of shares a lot with poetry, and you do have to work. I always.
What do you mean by vertical and not horizontal?
Well, I think Luke was talking about the way that actually you're holding a lot of different threads in your mind. In fact, you might even be picking up more and more threads as you go through the story. So therefore, if you think about a plot-based story, you're really sort of reading to get to the end, and it's very much, and then a horizontal experience. But in short stories, you might often find yourself sort of maybe even taken out of time altogether and just actually stopping with a moment because you actually have to sort of process all of the things that are happening. And so therefore the experience, I think, can be sort of more vertiginous than, say, that reading sort of across the story. But also, if you read it across, then you're probably going to miss out on a lot of, sort of the richness that the short story is offering, because, it takes life and it packs it in and it makes it strange and it makes it intense. And, sort of at the end of it, I always tell my students, maybe you can only read one short story a day. Like, maybe you can't do more reading after that. It's like a poem. Maybe you can only read a stanza and then you have to stop in order to really honour what's going on in the poem. So
yeah, I found that, actually been thinking a lot about that this year when I've been reading shorts, particularly when it's by the same writer. So say with Ferocious Animals or Claire Amman's, another short story writer from StorySALOON, from her book Bird Country. It was just like, I'm going to read the story and then I'm putting the whole book down.
Yeah.
And I'm just going away because I just want to let that story percolate and to enjoy it and reflect on it and not binge. Like we love to binge,
Yes.
with our streaming and whatnot, but actually to not binge. And that I think it's a very good short story can enrich you as much as a novel, which doesn't mean it's worse or better. I don't want the forms to compete with each other. That's not what the conversation is about. But there will be enough richness, that verticality or vertiginousness, where every element of the story is speaking to every other element of the story, but in the first reading you're not necessarily picking up on all of that, but in your reflection you do. I think, so we've, the brevity, the compression, there's such important elements to the short story. But even though they're short, they're so hard to write. But on the other hand, you can get one finished in much less time than a novel. So there is that also as another plus.
Yeah, that's
to
true.
the short story.
I think as a writer, I may be about to offend novelists here. That's not my intention. It feels like you've got less material to work with, and at least for me anyway, it feels easier to perfect that material. I have this image or this metaphor in my head when I'm thinking about writing short stories of like wringing out a wet towel. And it's a weird one, so bear with me. But I feel like you write a draft and you give this towel a squeeze and most of the water comes out. But of course, if you squeeze it again, you're still going to get more water. And how many times can you squeeze that towel before not a single drip comes out? It's quite a lot. And over 3,000 words, that to me feels a little bit what the drafting process is like. Like I'm just going back and wringing this story more and more and more until not a single drip comes out of it. And the prospect of doing that across 80,000 or 100,000 words feels impossibly daunting to me, whereas I feel that in the space of 3,000 words or 2,000, 5,000, that, yeah, I can get closer to that. I can get closer to that goal of having a dry towel, end metaphor.
Wow.
I won't use the towel anymore.
Reminds me, Carol Shields uses, the late, great Carol Shields, a Canadian writer. She has lots of those sort of visual metaphors that she's written about that guide her with her writing, about chapters being like coats that go onto a coat hanger in the wardrobe, and then another novel was like a series of train carriages that she needed to people each carriage. Michelle, do you have any images, visual metaphors for your short story writing?
No, I definitely can't compete with the wet towel. It's just, I think,
His writing is like a wet towel. That'll be on the back of the next cover, yeah. He writes
but
like
it is so perfect.
wet towel.
But it is so perfect, and actually, there's a real skill in wringing the towel down. I love that. I love that.
And I guess
metaphor.
if you're working, if you have the glorious experience of working with a sympathetic editor, then the editor is holding the other end of the towel. You remember doing that? I remember doing that with my mum.
My friend taught me to do that. I'd never seen it before. But
squeezing out jeans. One person would hold one end of the jeans and the other person the other end of the jeans.
See, it's catching on. It was a good metaphor.
Yeah. And both of you, you teach creative writing. You've worked with many, many students writing short stories. Michelle, you've been a former editor of Southerly, fiction editor, and Mascara Literary Review. And Luke, you were struggling to remember that you had actually been fiction editor for one of the issues of Ireland, and you're incoming fiction editor for the Southerly Journal. How do you know when you read a story that it's definitely going into the shortlist?
It's the one that has a strong afterlife, but it can also be really immediate, and I don't know it until I see it. So I think it's one of those. I always think there's something like alchemy about reading and writing. So you open it, and if you go in thinking I'm looking for a kind of story, I sort of feel like you should step out of the space.
Yeah.
I think being totally sort of open to whatever it is that you find in, sort of submittable is the absolute prerequisite, and allowing yourself to be surprised by what does take you and then being prepared to go with it.
Which sounds, when you describe it like that, it sounds like you're working from your gut, which is fine. But actually, it's an art to be able to do that. Having worked in these roles myself, to, as it were, again and again, open yourself up to what another text might present to you, and put aside all your irritations and your tiredness and your biases, and you can't ever do it all. It is a skill and an art.
And sometimes I think it's horrible, because the hardest thing is that you can't publish the number of stories that probably need and deserve to be published. And for me, that was the thing that really just made me want to tap out, because it broke my heart not to be able to, when it comes down to the fact that you've got fantastic stories and each one of them is wonderful and in their own right, but you can only take one or two or whatever. Who wants to make that call? I have much admiration for you, Luke.
Well, I agree. I suppose it is an art and it requires skill and so on, but I think there's something instinctive about it as well, and that instinct has been honed over a number of years and a lot of reading. So the people that work at these journals tend to be people who are not at the beginnings of their writing or reading careers. They're people that have seen a lot of writing, and if you've taught creative writing at a university like all of us have, then you have seen a lot of writing over the years. And yeah, at some point you just have to rely on the fact that you're going to make the right call. If I come back to the sporting analogy that I had earlier on, you practice the shots in the cricket nets or on the practice tennis court or whatever, time after time, practice a particular shot in the hope that when you get out there in the game, you're not going to have to think about it. The ball's going to fly at you and you're going to react and respond as you need to. And there's a little bit of that goes on, whether it's editing for a journal or whether it's reading 100 stories that have been submitted this semester by your lovely students. There is this conscious dimension that kicks into gear when you've got to write feedback and so on, and you realise, hang on, what was I actually teaching this person, asking them to do? Did they do it? But the part that really connects, the kind of the art in the story, if you like, is for me something that I don't tend to think too deeply about, or at least I tend to think about it more afterwards. It's why did that resonate with me so strongly? And I do a kind of post-mortem on my own immediate impressions. But I think that it's usually something that it doesn't always work this way, but usually within the first paragraph I can tell whether this is a story that I'm going to like. I've been pleasantly surprised and unpleasantly surprised on occasions. But it's something about the DNA of this piece of writing, the alchemy that you mentioned before, that is it's just there from the outset. And they're the moments that you're kind of looking for or hoping will come along. And they're the ones that usually get the tick of approval, I think.
Mm. And then, unfortunately, there's too many with the tick of approval. And then there's so many reasons why stories do and don't get published in journals. Yeah. Just one more thing that I would like to talk to you about before we wrap up. Because we have been talking about literary journals, there are not many literary journals in Australia, and they don't have tens and tens and tens of thousands of readers, and yet paradoxically they are critical to Australian writing and the community and the ecology. So, Michelle, why do they matter, and why are they important to writers?
Look, they matter for so many reasons, because they provide a writer with purpose. I've written stories. Where are they going? What am I doing with them? So whether or not you're successful or not.
They're an imagined audience.
They're an imagined audience. They become this wonderful and that's what I think of particularly with Meanjin, for example, which has all of its issues online and digitally available, and you can literally sort of walk through the pages of Australian writing from 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and suddenly something emerges that otherwise wouldn't exist. So as an archive, but also as a way of building community, because suddenly you're not writing alone, you're writing as part of a journal. Somebody now knows you, because you tend not to forget the names of the people that you've published. They become somebody to you, you become somebody to them. Also, you don't generally go from a creative writing student at uni or at home or in a community group or whatever to a novel published famous author. There's all these steps in between that are often invisible to a larger sort of mainstream audience, but that are absolutely essential and dependent upon the existence of literary journals. So I think they're small, but they are such an essential part of generating any kind of writing community, any kind of writing culture. How do we have an Australian literary culture if we don't have journals?
Luke, I mean...
Yeah, I can't really... I would just second all of that. I would just add that if they are important to you and you want to see yourself in one day, then you need to subscribe to them. This
and
is
read
the fundamental problem.
But I
it's
think
like an insurance policy. You may not need it when you're young, but it doesn't work if the people that don't need it are not chipping money into it. So I think don't have much patience for people whinging about the collapse of journals who are not actively supporting the journals. So it's clear where the problem lies, that there just aren't enough people pledging their support, their monetary support to these journals. So everything that Michelle said is 100% true. I think they are absolutely vital for someone who's trying to build a writing career. They are that necessary stepping stone that you need to get from somebody that was learning how to write to somebody who's able to call themselves a writer in their own right. So if they disappear completely, I have no idea what happens next. To me, that feels like a training ground is just gone, and I dread the prospect of that happening.
Yeah. And I think actually one other really important aspect is almost all of our literary culture is based on commercial profit. You know, literary journals are operating under a completely different logic. They are genuinely trying to find stories that excite, that are different, that challenge, that imagine what the world could be like, not what it is, not what they think somebody will pay for.
Yeah.
And what happens when that doesn't exist? Are we just condemned to what will make a profit? You know, what people will buy for Christmas presents and, you know, Mother's Day presents? Because, you know, that's a scary world. And I think actually it's a bigger sort of level of support that really needs to happen for literary journals, because I think even if the people who write, you know, and are interested subscribing, I don't think that's enough, because that precarious grant-based existence grinds people into a pulp.
It's horrible.
And what should really happen is that we should acknowledge how important they are, support them, because actually we want an articulate nation. And
we do.
Yeah.
And the subscribing is so important. I mean, you can't afford to subscribe to everything, so my recommendation is just subscribe to one year and then change the subscription and change to another the next year.
Christmas present.
Just share the love. We've got to wrap up now. So thank you, Luke, and thank you, Michelle. Listeners, you can, and I would really recommend you listen to each of their short stories, episodes 22 and 23 on the StorySALOON podcast. StorySALOON is going to return in 2026. So
Huzzah.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Michelle and Luke.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Luke.
You've been listening to an episode of In the SALOON with. Your host has been Jane Messer, recording by Martin Gallagher, along with sound design. A big thanks to the whole StorySALOON team.